Hey everybody, welcome to part 2 of our two-part series on airbrushing. This evening I'm going to show you the techniques that I use in the rotation of my arm, my wrist, and how I rotate the part in order to get really good coverage of paint on the surface of the parts. You know, about 40 years ago, this book came out for Linden, Letterman, and Stoke on plastic wings, and they had a really good statement in here about airbrushing. The paint should go on wet. If the paint goes on dry, you're susceptible to what's called the orange peel effect, and that happens when you rub your finger right across that surface of the paint after you've airbrushed, and you can see a streak. That means that the paint dried before it got onto the surface of the model. So, when you watch my videos and you see how I'm rotating the part, you'll notice that the paint is very wet, and that's what you want to get. And that's one of the secrets of good airbrush technique. Make sure that that paint goes on wet. And that's a combination of the pressure, the source of the air pressure source, the type of pressure that you're using, the type of paint that you're using, how you're holding your airbrush, and the distance between the tip of that airbrush and the part. With all of that said, let's get started on part 2.
This is how I hold my airbrush. I use my pinky to hold the paint bottle in place up against the bottom of the airbrush, and my index finger is used to control the flow of the paint. Here, I'm testing the paint before I start to airbrush. And notice how I'm using smooth strokes in order to apply the paint to the surface. Note how close the tip of the airbrush is to the surface of the model. The shiny appearance of the paint means that the paint is going on wet, and the air pressure is just right. My air pressure has been adjusted to about 17 psi, which is perfect for the application of this primer onto the surface of this 148 scale B24D wing. Watch how I'm using the movement of my arm, my wrist, and rotating the part on the foam board in order to get a really good coat of paint on the entire surface of this wing. I've moved the wing to the drying table, and now I'm going to airbrush some of the smaller parts. This is where being able to hold on to the tip of the balsa wood strip is really important. I always test the paint every time I use the airbrush and before I apply the paint to any of these parts. I've made a slight adjustment to the volume of the paint and reduced it because I'm airbrushing small parts. I'm using an overlay narration because the exhaust fan is really loud, so it would be impossible for me to talk to you through a microphone while I'm doing this airbrushing. I've also sped up the video just a little bit to save some time. Using an airbrush allows you great flexibility in scale modeling. You can mix your own colors and ensure that the paint is applied smoothly and evenly on every part. During long airbrush sessions, when you're painting a lot of parts, check the tip of the airbrush with the Q-tip to ensure that paint hasn't built up on the inside of the tip. If it does, it could splatter onto the surface of the parts. I like elevating my propellers on a length of plastic rod inserted into the back of the propeller so that I can airbrush both the front and the back as well as the sides of the propeller blades. Mounting parts on these small sections of foam board really enhances your ability for airbrushing and getting all of the surfaces of these smaller parts covered. Mounting fuselage halves to foam board makes it really easy to airbrush all the small areas and angles on the inside of the fuselage halves. Notice the movement of my wrist. Here again, you can also notice that the paint is going on shiny, which means it's wet. I always prime the surfaces of my models as it provides a good base coat for the finished colors. Work on one fuselage half at a time and make sure to check your work as you progress. I like to use short bursts of my airbrush in order to control the paint flow so that I don't apply too much paint, which can cause dripping. It's kind of hard to see it, but my index finger is going up and down on the button multiple times as I'm covering the area as well as rotating the part and manipulating both my arm and my wrist to get all the interior surface areas covered. Sometimes on long airbrushing sessions on interior parts like fuselages, you have to mix the paint up to ensure that both the thinner and the paint remains mixed together. Here, I'm checking the small interior areas of the fuselage to ensure that the entire surface of the interior has been painted. It's really important to check your parts before you proceed to the finished coat colors. So here, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm checking the wings, the small parts, and the fuselage interiors to ensure that I don't need to apply any more primer. Now that I'm at a breaking point, I've removed the microphone and I finally put on my painting mask, which I use for every airbrushing session to protect my lungs. My next paint application is the zinc chromate yellow for the interior. So what I'm doing here is an interim step of cleaning the interior of the airbrush without having to disassemble it. I'm cleaning the siphon tube and the siphon cap of much of the paint as I can before I drop it into the bowl of the thinner and let it sit for a while. I'll just grab a new siphon cap for the next color. Now I'll start cleaning out the interior of the airbrush. I'll use several Q-tips soaked with thinner to clean out the underside of the siphon entry point, and then I'll attach a jar of thinner to the bottom of the siphon and spray thinner through the airbrush to clear out all of the paint. What I'm doing here is adjusting the airbrush's needle so that all of the inside of the airbrush, from maximum flow to minimum flow, is cleaned. It's also important to clean the tip of any excess thinner that may reside inside that area. Now it's time to work with the zinc chromate yellow. While shaking it up, I realized that there were several copper BBs inside the finished paint color from the initial paint mixing process. After cleaning the top of the paint jar as well as the cap, I applied the cap back on but didn't tighten it all the way. I left it a little bit loose, and then I put the paint on top of the paint warmer. That's on the left-hand side of my paint booth. Here, I'm cleaning the tweezers that I removed the copper BBs with some thinner so that I can use those tweezers again and again without ruining the paint colors. What I'm doing here is checking the paint to ensure that it's warm enough in order to proceed with the next step, which is to apply that finish coat of zinc chromate yellow. Applying the finished colors, you will use the same techniques for rotating the part, movement of your arm and your wrist in order to get a nice, even, wet coat of paint. When airbrushing, it's really important to use thin coats of paint. Multiple thin coats of paint are much better than one thick coat of paint, which can cover small details. I've had to adjust the needle several times and clean the tip several times, which tells me that the paint is a little too thick. So what I'm going to do is thin out the paint just a tad before I proceed with the second part of the airbrushing session on the upper fuselage half. Now that I've got more thinner applied, I'll go ahead and mix up the paint. I'll go ahead and clean the airbrush a little bit and then use a new siphon cap to proceed with my airbrushing. With a little bit more thinner, the paint flow is much better. Now it's time to airbrush the interior color on some of the smaller parts. And here again, manipulating the foam board in combination with arm movement and wrist movement gives you great coverage of paint on all of the parts. The additive effect of using a good airbrush, having a good air supply source, the type of paint that you're using, how you mix the paint, your parts preparation, and the techniques that you use to airbrush the paint onto the parts, as well as finally, as I mentioned in the beginning, keeping that airbrush clean, all add up to a superior paint finish. Now it's time to clean the airbrush. I like to use a Badger 200 airbrush. It's a single action bottom feed brush. It's got all chrome parts and it's got a hefty weight to it. I've used Badger 200 airbrushes for 30 years and they have never failed me. And they're easy to take apart and clean. I usually start by cleaning the siphon cap as well as the siphon tube, and I go through a lot of pipe cleaners cleaning that siphon tube. It's really important to get that siphon tube clean and get all of the paint out of both the siphon cap and the tube. Before I take my airbrush apart, I try to get rid of as much of the paint as I can from the bottom of the siphon area, and then I'll run thinner through the airbrush before I take it apart. As I run thinner through the part, I'll adjust the needle and the back of the airbrush for maximum flow and then all the way down to minimum flow in order to get as much of the paint off of the needle and the interior of the airbrush as possible. Now it's time to disassemble my trusty Badger 200 airbrush. Even though I've run a lot of thinner through the airbrush before I took it apart, the needle always has residual paint on it, which is why it's important to take that airbrush apart and clean it well. I go through a lot of tissues and different size Q-tips for all of my airbrushing sessions. But you know what? My airbrush has lasted me over 20 years. Just like any tool that you use, you have to maintain them. And with an airbrush, it's really important to clean it after every session to get all the residual paint out of there and prepare it for the next time you're going to use it. I use tiny Tamiya Q-tips to clean the tip of the airbrush. Tamiya makes several different sizes and shapes of these Q-tips, and I highly recommend that you keep a good supply of these on hand for all of your airbrushing needs. Now that I'm done cleaning all of the airbrushing parts, I'll set them aside and let them dry before I put the airbrush back together. The other thing I like to do is after each project is complete, I'll take the airbrush apart and the small parts will get soaked in lacquer thinner for a few hours to remove any residual paint particles that may still reside inside of the parts. That works really well for me, and it's well worth the effort to do that.
Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed our two-part series on airbrushing, and have a great evening. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and if you get the chance, visit our website at www.mikeesche.com and stay tuned for our multi-part series on building the Revell Monogram 1/48 scale B24D. Have a great evening.